Evening, everyone. Welcome to the BIM Talk session for December. My name is Moses Itonla. I'm the Executive Director of BIM Africa Initiative. We have with us today Paul Shillcock from Operam Academy, who will be talking on ISO 19650, a global opportunity. I really do look forward to an insightful session, and I hope that you are also ready to learn. So, Paul, we can start while others join in as the sessions continue. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Moses. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. First of all, thank you for Moses for the kind introduction, and obviously thank you to BIM Africa for inviting me along today to speak with you about ISO 19650 and the global opportunity that it presents us and our industry in terms of helping us to move forward to digitize the way in which we work and manage information more effectively. So, my name is Paul Shillcock. I'm currently the Managing Director of Operam. I'm a military engineer by background. I served within the Royal Engineers for around 10 years. And still to this day is probably the most collaborative environment that I've worked in terms of individuals and teams working together to achieve an overall objective. I started on a drawing board and went through the transition from the drawing board to CAD, and I could see a lot of similarities in terms of the cultural aspect of that transition that we're going through at the moment in terms of from traditional CAD moving forward towards BIM. And I think that experience in terms of working together and overcoming those challenges seemed to be a lot easier in the military. It was only when I come out that I discover things like profit and contracts, which seem to put a lot of barriers in terms of supporting that collaboration and the transition. I guess one of my major roles since leaving the military was with London Underground, which I'm sure most of you have heard from. My role there really was to try and improve the way in which London Underground, as the largest asset owner in London, procured, used and managed information about their vast asset base. Initially, my role sort of looked at in terms of the technology side and a centralized repository for where all the information about the assets could be held. But it became very apparent early on that technology wasn't really the barrier. London Underground's a large institutionalized organization. It's very unionized, and so in terms of the biggest barriers that we had to overcome during the 5 years that I was there was certainly around the people. And so one of the things that we did is we set that up as a change program. And it was only at that point that we actually started to get some traction in terms of adoption and introducing new ways of working. And it's off the back of that work that I was invited along by initially by the UK government to help with the UK government construction strategy, but also the BSI, the British Standards Institution, to help with the development of some of the standards that were going to support the initiative within the UK, which we call, what at the time was called BIM Level 2. And I was co-author of PAS 1192 Part 2, which is essentially the framework document for BIM Level 2. And I've been involved in the development of the UK 1192 series from that point. And it was around 2012 that I decided to set up on my own, really to try and support other organisations in terms of their adoption and alignment with industry standards and best practice. So I set up Operam. There's two sides to the business. One is around the advisory. So we're quite fortunate to be able to, we've been trusted by a lot of organisations around the world to help them to align with industry standards and best practice, but essentially to build better teams. And then the other side of that is around education, which often forms quite a large part of the advisory in terms of educating and quite often sometimes re-educating individuals within that organisation. And in 2014, I was asked by ISO to elevate the UK 1192 series to its national, to become a global standard. And so ISO 19650 has been a large part of my life for the past 5 years or so. I'm I guess, lead author of ISO 19650 Part 2 and the UK National Annex. I'm currently supporting the working groups to develop Parts 3 and Part 5. And then lastly, about 2 years ago, again, looking at the lack of education around the process side of BIM, we decided to set up an online learning solution, which we call Operam Academy, to help organizations, but particularly the management functions within those organizations, to understand and learn about their role within the information management process. So today, what I'd like to talk about is in terms of obviously the ISO 19650 series and the global opportunity that presents, which essentially you can boil down to just enabling us to hopefully get rid of some of those wasteful activities that we see almost on every project that we deliver, and taking that beyond into the operational phase. As a global standard, it's essentially that an ISO is just an agreed way of doing things. It's not necessarily the best way of doing things, but it's something that has been agreed by the different countries around the world. And the benefits of ISO 19650 and indeed any international standard is that by adopting a globally agreed standard, teams, external teams, when they come together to work, they have a good understanding about how each other's working. There's mobility of resources from a project to project, so they don't have to relearn how to do it on this project and relearn it again how to do it on the next project. It also enables us to educate the next generation. So what we're looking to do now is, in terms of the ISO, is to get that into schools, get that into colleges and universities, so that we can train the next generation of professionals, so that when they come into the industry, they're ready to go. They understand the process, they understand their role in the process, and they're ready to go. Another aspect of the global opportunity is around the technology providers. A lot of those, when we, as an industry, because we work with so many different standards and almost start reinvent the wheel on every project, the technology providers being a little bit hesitant to invest in configuring their solutions to be able to support the way in which we work. By having a global agreed standard and that is widely adopted, we're starting to see already that some of the technology providers are now starting to invest to provide us with the tools that we need to be able to implement that process. But ultimately, because it's a degree process, what it means is that it allows you to repeat something, and if you can repeat it on project, you can measure it, and if you can measure it, then you can improve it. Okay, so there's lots of value in terms of alignment and adoption. And I think what we're trying to say here in terms of the industry is that the days of my standard and my way of working are finally over. Okay, we're starting to see a rapid adoption of ISO 19650 and the other standards. And I think it's only going to be a matter of time before those individuals who continue to work to their own way of working are going to be left out in the cold somewhat. Okay, so in terms of, although I'm down as the lead author, it certainly wasn't just my only effort. There's a lot of individuals behind the development of ISO 19650. From an ISO perspective, that comes down to responsibility of ISO Technical Committee 59, Standards Committee 13, which look after the organisation and digitalisation of information about building and civil engineering works, and including this thing, BIM. For SC 13, we saw quite a lot of active participation. As with any steering committee, there is a secretariat, for which ISO 19650 was Norway. We had 31 participating members. So these are members who are actively involved in the development of the standards as from a working group perspective. And then 14 observing members. So these were countries who weren't able to provide their own individual experts, but were involved in terms of the review and the voting process. So it gives you a list of the different members, both participating and observing. As you've probably already gathered from an African perspective, the only one we've got in there is Egypt, who are one of the observing members. So not a huge amount of involvement from Africa, but I think in terms of the adoption and the interest in the ISO, I think we're starting to see a lot more progress and a bit of momentum starting to build up within the African continent. So in terms of the objective, when we started this piece of work, really we sat down together as a working group to try and establish an internationally agreed series of standards that will initially to enable the receivers of information to be able to communicate their requirements and procure information about their assets effectively. And I think, it's no secret, this is not something that we're very good at. It's not something that clients generally are very good at in terms of being able to define and communicate their requirements for information. So that was a clear objective in terms of what we set out to do. On the flip side, it was also to enable the providers that information to manage the production and delivery of information in accordance with what was deemed to be industry best practice in terms of the collaborative production of information. In terms of what we've seen over the past decade or so, the tools in which we're using have certainly changed greatly. But what hasn't changed is the way in which we manage information and produce that information. And so ISO 19650 gives us that opportunity to look at the best of the best from around the world and try and get that agreed approach. As a globally agreed standard, it also helps large multinational organizations or indeed organizations who work in different regions and countries to adopt a unified approach to the management and production of information across each of the regions or countries. We started to see the rise of the sort of super consultant, where organizations now are working in large numbers of different countries. As from a resource point of view, that means that they have to relearn and the way in which, or change the way in which they manage and produce information when working in each country. So by having an alignment with a global standard, it enables them to adopt a unified approach. But ultimately, it was just about ensuring that the right people get the right information at the right time. Clearly something that should be very clear and obvious and very easy to say, but something that as an industry we've really struggled to achieve over the past few decades, if at all. So one of the things that I learned in terms of developing ISO is that you can't just sit down and write an international standard. It has to be based on something that is deemed to be industry best practice. And in this case, that was deemed to be the UK 1192 series. Now, this wasn't about the UK saying, hey, look at us, everyone should use our standards. This was actually a pull from the global international community. From developing these standards and implementing them within the UK, what we saw is actually the UK 1192 series was widely adopted around the world, particularly around Australia, New Zealand, Australia, New Zealand, Middle East, and certain parts of Africa as well. And it was really the international communities that were saying that these really should be elevated to ISO. That's what we did. At the moment, the ISO 19650 series, it comes in 5 parts. Not all of them are published at the minute, but these are what we've got in the pipeline. With part 1, what you're going to get is around the concepts and principles behind the management of information throughout the asset lifecycle. Okay, so this is not just about projects, this is not just about the delivery phase, this is about the management of information throughout the entire asset lifecycle. So part 1 talks around the concepts and principles around that. In part 2, we start to dive a bit deeper and start to look at the management of information during the delivery phase of assets. And both parts 1 and 2 were published in exactly 12 months ago, in December 2018. And at the moment, it's only parts 1 and 2 that are currently available. In part 3, we start to look at the operational phase of assets and the effective management of information throughout that operational phase. For me, part 3 really is the prequel to part 2. So from an asset management perspective, organizations should really start with part 3 in terms of understanding their need, and then going into part 2 in terms of that delivery. Part 4 is currently being scoped, and that's going to look around the effective exchange of information between parties. So start to look at the relationship between receivers and providers, and how those requirements can be clearly defined, but also validated and verified in terms of being delivered by the provider. And then last but not least, we've got part 5. Part 5 looks around at the adoption of a security-minded approach to managing information. This came about really because in terms of most asset owners who looked after critical infrastructure, their main information security policy was one of chaos, on the basis that if they couldn't find the information, then it's unlikely anybody else can. Now we're moving to a world where data is structured and can easily be found. That means that asset owners, particularly those who look after sensitive assets, such as critical national infrastructure, need to start adopting a security-minded approach to ensure that the information doesn't fall into the wrong hands. So that's the 19650 series as at the moment. So what does that mean for the UK 1192 series? Well, in terms of ISO, what that means is BS 1192 and PAS 1192 Part 2, which are the key documents, are being withdrawn and replaced by ISO 19650 Part 1 and Part 2. In terms of the branding around this, we've recently, about 2 months ago, the UK relaunched what's called the UK BIM framework. So the 1192 series, as it was, with the addition of the ISO 19650 Part 1 and Part 2, are now formed as the UK BIM framework. And this is what is required now on all publicly funded projects as from 2016. Moving forward, when Part 3 and Part 5 are published, they will also replace PAS 1192 Part 3 and PAS 1192 Part 5 respectively, which we anticipate around Q3 of next year. So at the moment, BS 1192 Part 4 and PAS 1192 Part 6, which you can see there, will remain in place as part of the UK BIM framework. Okay, so let's move on in terms of ISO 19650 Part 1. So as I say, this looks at the concepts and principles. And I think just to pause for a moment in terms of the title of the series. There's still a lot of people who see 19650 as a BIM standard. Okay, but if we look at we've been quite careful in terms of the title, and it's about the organisation and digitalisation of information, both for buildings or vertical assets and also civil engineering works in terms of linear assets. Okay, and it's about the management of information when using BIM. Okay, it's not a BIM standard, it's an information management standard, which enables us as an industry and projects and teams to be able to exploit the opportunity that building information modelling can offer us. Okay, so Part 1, as I mentioned, it looks around the entire life cycle of an asset. And for that, we'll start in terms of the organisation and the organisations that look after these assets. And that could be a commercial building, it could be a residential building, it could be a school, it could be a hospital, power station, or even a train station, or an entire train network. It really doesn't matter. But this, in order for these organisations who look after these or who run these organisations, they need to have some sort of organisational management, which how and which they do what they do, okay, whatever it is. And for that, from an international standard perspective, we've got ISO 9001, which sets out and defines the quality management system, which establishes how they do what they do. In order for them to do what they do, the likelihood is that they're going to need some sort of physical asset. Okay, and to get that, they're going to have to both deliver the asset and also maintain it throughout its operational use. And again, so from an organisational point of view, that brings into play asset and project management. And from standards point of view, we have ISO 55000 and ISO 21500. Now, in terms of these management functions, both for organisational, asset and project, they're all fantastic in terms of the standards that help an organisation to undertake that management function effectively. What they all have in common is that they're all equally dependent on good quality information that can be trusted. Where the standards in terms of 9001, 55000 and 21500 fall short is explain to these organisations how they get that information, how they get the information that they need to do what they need to do, to be able to procure the new assets and also to operate and maintain those assets effectively. And that is why we need information management as that additional management function. And that is where ISO 19650 fits in terms of helping organisations to get the right information at the right time to the right people so that they can undertake the management functions that they need to do. And this is from an asset perspective, this runs right throughout the operational life of that asset, both from the delivery phase and also through the operational phase. So if you've had a look at ISO 19650 Part 1, you'll see this diagram is at the fore, and the concept and principles behind it will really back that up. And this just shows the different sections of ISO 19650 Part 1. So we've got things like the terms and definitions, the delivery cycle of the life cycle of information throughout the asset life cycle, the collaborative-based work and how to manage the collaborative production of information within a shared repository, which we all now know and love as a common data environment. So that's Part 1. In terms of Part 2, as I say, we start to get into a little bit more detail now in terms of the management of information throughout the delivery phase of assets. And this essentially is based around the project information management process. As a process, there are 8 steps within the process. And like any process, it's a series of interrelated activities that convert an input to an output. In this case, the input is a need for information, and the output is an information model, both a graphical and a non-graphical representation of the asset and its associated record documentation that fulfills that need. So within the 8 steps, they all need to be undertaken for each and every project. However, steps 2 to 7, in terms of the activities, they need to be undertaken for each and every appointment on the project. An appointment can be a formal appointment in terms of a contract, or it could be an internal appointment through a work instruction, such like. The likelihood in most projects that there will be more than one appointment. And these are broken down in terms of the procurement stage, the information planning stage, and then the production stage. And as I say, if you've got more than one appointment on your project, what that means is that you have to repeat these activities for each and every appointment on the project. So within the 8 steps, there are actually 40 activities, okay? 75% of which, so 30 of those activities, are undertaken before you put the proverbial pen to paper. So this as a process is very much looks at the upstream activities, not necessarily just around the production. The activities within the ISO 19650 Part 2 is allocated to one of the parties. And this diagram here is to indicate in terms of the different parties which we've identified. So from this diagram, you can take away that for every project, there will only be a single appointing party. An appointing party generally known as a client, an owner, or an employer. And it's typically the client on the project. On the other side of that, we've got the appointed parties. Okay, and these make up the different task teams and also the delivery teams. In addition to that, we've got the lead appointed party, which is simply an appointed party which has the direct appointment with the appointing party. Okay, so in terms of the way in which the activities are defined, they're defined as requirements within, so each activity has its own clause within Part 2. And so for this example here, this activity is around establishing the project's information production methods and procedures. And what you'll notice is in terms of the modal verb shall. So every activity is written in the same way in terms of somebody shall do something. And that's what makes it a specification. So every activity within the process needs to be undertaken in order to conform with the process within Part 2. To give it the scalability, what we've also done for a number of requirements is to add a subclause. And what this does is, in terms of the main clause, we've added an additional. In doing this, the person responsible shall consider, and then there will be a list of items. And so providing that you can demonstrate that you've considered what's in that list, if you deem it not to be applicable to your project, maybe you're working on a low value or low complexity project, then you need to be to conform with the information management process. So there are 40 activities within the process. So they are at the back of Part 2, you'll find Annex A, which gives you the information management responsibility matrix template. What we've done is we've listed all of the different activities, and this is the very first activity of the process for the appointing party or the client. what they need to do is to go through each activities and make a decision whether or not they feel they have capability or capacity to undertake that activity that they've been assigned. And as you all know, at this moment, not all clients have got the relevant capability to actually undertake the activities. So in that case, they have two choices. They can either employ a third party to undertake the activity on their behalf, or they can discharge that responsibility to one of the appointed parties. Okay, so by filling this out, what you end up with essentially is a scope of services. The appointing party can include as part of their tender in terms of assigning responsibility for the different activities within the process. Okay, so that's a very quick overview in terms of what you're going to get within parts 1 and parts 2. The other thing I wanted to talk about is around how do you implement ISO 19650 at a national level. And I think this is something that a lot of countries around the world are starting to scratch their heads at. There's also this thing around, do we have a government mandate? Do we need a government mandate? For me, the answer is simply no. Okay, nobody needs a mandate in order to adopt and conform with ISO 19650. But in terms of implementation at national level, the first thing that needs to happen is, as a country, the national standards body of that country needs to adopt the ISO as a national standard. Upon adopting it as a national standard, what you then get is a couple of options. So the first option is to include a national forward. Now, national forward, it can be as long or as short as needs be. So this is an example of the UK National Forward. As you can see, it just confirms the withdrawal of BS 1192 and PAS 1192 Part 2, but also starts to introduce in terms of mapping some of the terms that are used within ISO 19650 to its UK equivalent. So for any country, what they can do in terms of the national forward, they can look at different terms within ISO 19650, and if they feel that that's not going to land or resonate very well in terms of that particular country, they start to map those across to understand what the equivalent definition is within that particular country. So there's some of the common applications in terms of a national forward. You also get the option of a national annex, and for part 2, it's actually a requirement for each country or region to develop a national annex. The reason being is during the development process, as I mentioned, there was a large number of different countries involved. As we were going through that process, it started to become clear that there were certain things that never in a million years were we going to get an international consensus on. So we came up with this idea of a national annex. And what that means is that it enables us to, well, first of all, it enables to get past the differences between each country, but enables us to then develop a unified approach, but allow each country or region to add clarifications to the different activities within the process when implementing 19650 within that particular country or region. So again, here's an example. At the moment, the UK, I think, is one of the few countries who have developed a national annex, so I haven't got too many examples at the moment, but from a UK perspective, this is our national annex. In it, what you're able to do is add clarifications. So what you can't do is add additional requirements to the process. All you can do is add clarifications. The way you do that is you identify what it is you're trying to clarify. So you include the particular clause number from the ISO. So in terms of this clause 123, somebody shall do something. And then you follow that up with, well, in this country, okay, when doing blah, 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 you should, and then you can add your clarification. Okay, and so in terms of this, what you can see, so the modal verbs are quite important. So the shall is only used from a requirement. What you're doing here is that in undertaking that you should. Okay, so it's not a normative requirement in terms of the ISO. So to give you an example, here we've got clause 5.1.1 6.7.c, which states that the common data environment shall enable each information container to have the following attributes, one of which is classification in accordance with the framework defined within another ISO standard, which is ISO 12006 Part 2. So what you can do here is say, okay, well, in this country, the classification of information for information containers should be in accordance with, and then you can nominate your particular classification system. Essentially, that needs to be your country's implementation of 12006 Part 2. So to give you an example, in the UK's implementation of 12006 Part 2 is called Uniclass. In the US, they've got a classification system called Omniclass. And generally, in some of the countries around Europe, they're starting to move along with something called CodeClass. So in terms of, it doesn't really matter which classification system you use, so long as it's aligned with ISO 12006, you're still meeting the requirements of the ISO, okay? But it enables countries to add that particular clarification. So in terms of the UK National Annex, these are some of the areas that we felt need clarification. So the first one is around the information container ID. So this is the, I guess, the name that we give each container within the common data environment. So this has been established now for a long while within BS 1192. We also made clarifications around the codification, so the codes that we want to use within each of those fields that make up the container ID. Likewise, for the information container metadata, in terms of the codification, things like which classification system that we're going to use within the UK. Also around some of the minimum deliverables from an information model that need to be exchanged with the client. So to give those organizations who may not have their own standards, I guess, a start of 10 in terms of the minimum deliverable. And then also around the principal work stages that we generally work with within the UK that allows other plans of work to be aligned to, so such as the RIBA plan of work and other, I guess, sort of bespoke plans of work that are quite common across the UK. So that's what we've got in terms of the UK National Annex. So at this stage, you have a national standard now. You've created your forward and you've created your national annex, but that still doesn't make it a requirement, okay? The only way to make ISO 19650 a requirement on a project or on any appointment is to actually undertake the activities and include it within the different appointments. So go back to our process, you'll see the very first step is around the assessment and need, and this is undertaken by the appointing party. And if we look at the activities within that step, you can start to see that this is really about the appointing party and what they need information is from a project requirements point of view, milestones, the project information standard, and the production of methods that need to be used. So this is all for the appointing party. Once they've actually done that, they're then able to include that within the invitation to tender. Okay, so all prospective lead appointed parties understand exactly what it is they're expected to deliver in terms of information, but also how they will be required to deliver that. And the successful appointed party will then have all of those things included within their appointment. And there's still a little bit of confusion around how that is actually achieved from an ISO perspective. So to give you some idea, the main thing in terms of a contract, and there are many different forms of contract around the world, and so this is a very sort of generic overview, but it's just really to hopefully it'll bring everything together. I think one of the major pitfalls around the appointment side is that a lot of the documentation that is produced, be it a BIM standard or a BIM execution plan, is generally just left on somebody's desk. From a legal perspective, it just doesn't exist. Okay, if there is a dispute at all on the project, then anything that's not referenced or appended to the contract will effectively be dismissed from a legal perspective. So how do we get that to become part of the actual contract? Well, the thing that links it all together is what we refer to as the project information protocol. And this is a document, forms part of the appointment documentation, and it starts to link and bind everything together in terms of the different outputs from the project. So here you can see we've got the appointing parties exchange information requirements, setting out what information they need and when. We've got the project information standard, which sets out the structure and how that information is to be produced. We've got the delivery team BIM execution plan, which sets out the approach that the delivery team are going to use in terms of the production and delivery of that information, and then around the detailed planning within the information delivery plans. So those documents are all form schedules of and are appended to the project information protocol, therefore making them part of the contract. Below that, what you've then got as the exchange information requirements is you then start to reference things like how you define your level of information need, some of the support information and reference information that may be needed to fulfill the exchange information requirements, but also looking at the acceptance criteria, some of the management production methods and procedures that may need to be used, particularly around the common data environment and how information is to be shared and published within that, and also things like the project information delivery milestones. So all of these are referenced within the exchange information requirement, which are then appended to the protocol. So all of this is now starting to form part of the appointment. Likewise with the project information standard. So this is a global standard. What this enables you to do is to actually start to say, okay, this is the information standard that we're going to use for this project. And within that, you can then start to reference any industry standards that are used locally within the country or the region, but also any standards or policies that the particular appointing party may have that they want to include within the project information standard. Again, this is not just something that somebody wrote and is sat on the desk. These are all now starting to form part of the contract. From a BIM execution plan, most of you should be familiar with this term, but within that, not only does it set out the approach of how information is going to be managed and produced, it also includes things like the delivery team's capability and capacity assessment, just to ensure that they are able to actually implement that proposed approach. The mobilisation plan and risk assessment, which are two new documents which we've added to the ISO. These are pre-contract or pre-appointment documents which explain to the appointing party how they're going to mobilise in terms of the team if they are successful, but also any risks that they deem applicable to the successful and timely delivery of that information throughout that appointment. So both of these can be used by the appointing party to make a more informed decision about the delivery team. And then last but not least, in terms of the information delivery, around the detailed responsibility matrix and the information delivery plans for each of the task teams within that particular delivery team. So this is just, as I say, this is not, I must stress, this is not legal advice. This is really just to give you an idea in terms of how appointment documents, mainly contracts, will start to look and be formed moving forward when aligning with ISO 19650. So in terms of where can I get, or where can you get more help? There's a lot of resources in development. Okay, so it's only been 12 months since the ISO was published. Hopefully, you've got a great resource in terms of BIM Africa and a community, which I'm sure we're all keen to get everybody involved in terms of that initiative and moving that forwards. If you haven't already, but you can find out a bit more at bimafrica.org. From a more detailed guidance perspective, what we saw and learn the lessons, I guess, from the development of the UK 1192 series is that the likes of the British Standards Institution, the Centre for Digital Britain, which is the government department leading this, and also the UK BIM Alliance, which is an industry community or forum that's brought together a lot of the different forums and communities from around the UK together. Those three parties are probably leading the way in terms of the transformation within the construction industry. The three of those agreed that rather than go off on their own and develop their own guidance, they would work together. And so what we've got so far is we've got parts 1 and parts 2. So parts 1 providing some detailed guidance around the concepts and principles, and part 2 some detailed guidance for the different activities within the project delivery. If you want to have a look at those documents, you head along to the ukbimalliance.org, where you'll be able to download those documents for free, as well as a whole raft of other sort of resources as well in terms of how the UK are getting on in terms of their adoption of Act 19650. If you're looking for something a little bit more formal in terms of learning and education, as I said at the start, a large part of what we do is around education. We've developed an online learning solution to help individuals to learn more about the process and the activities within it and understand their role within it. So if you're looking for something a bit more beyond guidance and a bit more formal, then head along to operamademy.com. Okay, that's probably more than enough from me. I'm really keen to hear what you all think, and if you've got any questions, I really want to see if I can be able to answer them. So I think we've got about 15 minutes left on the call. How are we going to do this, Moses? Is people able to just shout out?
Okay, thank you very much for the insightful presentation. I'm sure that we've all learned a lot from this. So please, if anyone has a question, you can either type it on the chat box or you can raise your hand to ask your question.
No? No one got any questions? All right, that's no problem. I've got, in terms of the details that we've got up on the screen, if you do have any questions, if there's something that you think about after the call, then feel free to drop me a line at info@operam.co.uk, or you can tweet us at Operam, and I'll do my best to answer those.
Okay, thank you very much once again for the session. And we do hope to get in touch over time as we begin. Okay, I think someone has got some question. Christopher, you can unmute your mic and ask a question. Okay, you want to type? No problem. Okay, just a minute.
I hope it's not a long question, Christopher.
I hope not. Okay, yes, type the question. He said, will it be right to say we are doing BIM according to ISO 19650 standard? If not, then what exactly should we define as a BIM standard?
Right, okay. So I guess the first thing is within the ISO standard, we have defined this term, which I've got to admit I'm not a huge fan of, which is BIM according to ISO 19650. I think for me, in terms of how you define that, there's still no sort of like legal definition of what BIM is, or indeed, you know, what BIM to ISO 19650 is. But as I say, as a process, you know, there are 40 activities within this process. You have to undertake each activity, and although the main process is taking an input to output, each activity, as in with any process, each activity requires an input in order to then undertake the activity and produce the output. So that's why there's really, you have to start at the very beginning. So for me, that's where it starts with the appointing party. Now, if you decide to just do a few of the activities, it doesn't mean what you're doing is wrong, but for me, you're not conforming with the requirements of ISO 19650. So I think looking at the question as you've asked it, Christopher, you know, the only thing that could say they were doing BIM according to ISO 19650 would be a project. Okay, this is very much a team sport. All right, this is not something that an individual or an individual company, for that matter, can undertake. So I think in terms of the project, if the appointing party or the clients and all of the delivery teams are undertaking the activities within ISO 19650, then for me, you are doing ISO 19650. All right. I don't know, does that answer the question?
Yes, I believe so. Mr. Christopher, that answers your question, right? Okay.
I think just to add to that, I think, you know, we are going through a transition, and we are starting to see, you know, a lot of clients moving. You know, a lot of their appointments or tenders that went out would be, you know, we want BIM. I think all what we're starting to see now is that we want ISO 19650. I think, you know, what they need to realise is that, you know, the first two steps, there are activities that they need to undertake first in order to provide the right collaborative and commercial environment for building information modeling to be done effectively. Okay, this is not something that you can just ask for, right? It's not a product off the shelf. All parties, particularly the appointing party, need to be involved and need to be undertaking the activities to provide the necessary outputs for the delivery teams to use as their inputs. But I think it'll take a little while for us to get there, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. I don't know if anyone else. Okay, Mr. Christopher Rose, I think what it means is that for every request of BIM on the project, it has to be clearly defined, right?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. As I say, you know, there's a lot of work going on right now, you know, to try and support the sort of the legal teams as much as anything, the people who are putting these invitations, tenders, and contracts together. You know, BIM as its own, as I say, is not something that you can just include as a requirement. Okay, it does need to be clearly defined, but more importantly, the activities within the process which enable BIM need to be undertaken. As I say, it's about getting all parties on the project to work together. Okay, if that doesn't happen, then you're unlikely to achieve the desired outcomes and benefits that BIM has to offer.
Okay, I'm sure I've learned a lot today. So since it seems there's no other question, I guess if we receive any question eventually, we'll forward it to you, your email. And also, if you have a question eventually, also feel free to email us at info@bimafrica.org and you can extend it to Mr. Paul. So thank you once again for your time and for the learning you shared with us today.
My pleasure.
We do believe we'll keep in touch.
I look forward to that.
All right. Thank you very much. And also, the recorded version of this presentation will also be on our YouTube channel, hopefully before the end of today or latest by tomorrow. So, in case you missed any portion of it, you can always go back there to watch it again. So, thank you very much.